Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we are going to discover another one of Simon Whistler's channels. This is Sideprojects. It's one of the ones apparently he's on now. And I thought this one might be an interesting one to take a look at. It's called War Myths You Believe Because of the Movies. I think we all understand that just because something is portrayed in a movie or on a TV show, that doesn't mean it's realistic. And a lot of times we have to suspend our disbelief in order to be entertained and enjoy. But it's also good, as those of us who love history know all too well, to understand what things really were like. So we'll watch some of these. I've also got I jotted down a few notes of my own of some things that I find to be pet peeves about movies, especially Civil War movies. And we'll see if they don't get covered. I'll mention some of mine at the end as well. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to check out this channel without my commentary. Big shout out and thank you to Meg in Northfield, Massachusetts. Meg, I know you and I have talked quite a bit in the past, so thank you for your support. And Bert in Hooksett, New Hampshire. So a couple of our New England friends today. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. Let's dive in.
War movies have been a staple of cinema since its inception, and over the decades, they've raked in billions of dollars at the box office, with hits like Saving Private Ryan and Dunkirk making hundreds of millions on their own worldwide. But, as well made as many of these films can be, the constraints of making war movies viewable and entertaining to an audience often leads to more than a few inaccuracies in their portrayal. Today,
and I once read or saw an interview with Tom Hanks where he talked about this, and he acknowledged the fact that even in a series like Band of Brothers, for example, where they strive really hard to make it as accurate as possible, like he recalled a conversation he had with Dick Winters where he told him, listen, most movies and TV shows are lucky if they get like 10% right, and we're going to strive to get like 17% right. You know, sometimes they have to do things just because of the medium that they're using, but some of it's just ridiculous and unnecessary.
To set the record straight.
Especially in World War I.
One of the most common myths, especially in depictions of the World Wars, is the idea that the majority of combat consisted of gunfights between individual soldiers or even hand-to-hand combat as waves of soldiers rushed enemy trenches. Make no mistake, this was definitely a large aspect of the fighting, but it pushes aside the immense role that artillery played in many of these conflicts. Oftentimes, artillery is depicted as a sort of background noise, a constant booming that kicks up dirt around the trenches while the troops and the main character charge forward.
So I'm going to try to wait until he finishes the best I can. I know I say that all the time because I don't want to interrupt and add something that then they say anyway. So I'll try to let each one of these finish before I talk about them.
In reality, the unreal thundering of a true artillery barrage would have dwarfed everything else in sight, and in many instances, artillery was actually responsible for more deaths than anything else. Take, for instance, the Battle of the Don, the longest and arguably most famous battle of the First World War, fought between the
303 days long this battle was.
Germans and the French on the Western Front. In total, there were about 800,000 casualties. Certainly a staggering number of deaths and injuries from just a single battle, but what's less known is that an estimated 70% of all of those casualties were from artillery alone. In their opening bombardment, the Germans fired an unbelievable 2 million shells, and over the course of the next 10 months, each side would exchange roughly 50 million more. It's completely understandable why most movies don't do much to show the true scale of artillery, as they'd much rather focus on characters and interesting action scenes instead of 12 straight hours of heavy shelling, but the point still stands. And it's not just depictions of World War I that are guilty of brushing artillery aside, but also World War II, movies featuring the Allies versus the Axis, some of the most common war films out there, but in general they also fail to show the power of artillery, and suffice to say, this was a war with some major bombardments. In fact, it contained what is regarded as the largest artillery bombardment of all time. When the Soviets had reached the German defenses dubbed the Gates of Berlin, centered around the city Silo, they prepared one of history's largest barrages to pave their way for soldiers. Lined up across a front line of more than 18 miles long, the Soviets showed up with more than 9,000 artillery guns, which comes out to about a gun placed every 11 feet. When given the order to fire, around 500,000 shells were blasted at the German lines in just 30 minutes. This absolutely obliterated everything in their way. Though it must be noted that this specific bombardment wasn't as effective as it could have been because the Germans had grown accustomed to the Soviet reliance on artillery across the Eastern Front and had already moved much of their men and equipment out of the way. But the fact that the Soviets were so reliant on it that the Germans had to adapt just drives home the point that artillery was the true backbone of many operations and continues to be underdepicted in modern movies.
All right, so a couple of things about that. Number one, when he talks about Verdun, absolutely. Verdun's probably one of the most classic examples of this. But it was true. It pretty much the standard in World War I was artillery to do a number of things. Soften up the target, try to destroy their trenches if you can. Sometimes you would use artillery to launch gas. You wanted to cut holes in their barbed wire with the artillery if you could. And you also wanted to use what was called a creeping barrage, which would keep the enemy's heads down while you advanced. And hopefully by the time your barrage lifted and moved on to the next target, you were right on top of the enemy's trenches. It didn't always work out that way, but by the end of the war, they got that down pretty good. It wasn't just Verdun that was 70%, probably throughout the entire war, World War I, about 70% of battle casualties were caused by artillery. It wasn't machine guns, it wasn't gas, it wasn't small arms fire, it wasn't tanks, it was artillery. Artillery did most of the damage in that war. Not only the physical damage, but the psychological damage. We've talked about this before, but if you're new to the channel, artillery wasn't, in World War I, it wasn't a boom, boom, boom. It was called drum fire for a reason. It was like a steady boom, 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 boom. Like you wouldn't even at times at places like Verdun or the Somme be able to distinguish between one artillery round and another. They were coming in so fast. And the psychological damage that would do to a person to sustain that kind of a shelling for a continual amount of time, just absurd. If you look at images, aerial shots of places like Passchendaele, and you look at like a shot from before the battle and a shot from after the battle, there's literally nothing there. It's worse than the moon. It's just craters everywhere. And anything that was above ground is just gone. Trees, buildings, people. It's all gone. We can't even begin to wrap our minds around the devastation caused by this artillery on man and machine alike. There are some times that it gets depicted pretty well. I think of Band of Brothers, the scenes in Bastogne. There's an episode called The Breaking Point where they show just some of the sustained, and it's only a few minutes of artillery. Imagine that for hours over and over and over and over again, which is what a lot of those guys faced in World War I. Just unbelievable.
It's a common scene in many war movies. The squad is sneaking their way through a city or a forest, scanning their surroundings for enemies. Suddenly, an explosion goes off and the entire group comes under fire. As they all blast their automatic rifles back in the general direction of their enemy, one of the young men begins yelling orders, organizing and rallying his comrades into a plan of action. Except, this wouldn't be so simple in real life, and that's because guns are way louder than they appear to be in movies. You might not...
Even, let's point out, when they are suppressed, and people use the term silencer. I think suppressor is probably more accurate. Even with a suppressor on, which didn't happen very often in a war, still pretty loud. It's not like this really silent thing that you see on TV.
Know this if you've never shot a firearm in real life, but not only are they loud, they are dangerously loud.
Yep.
Even a .22 caliber rifle, one of the smaller ones, can produce a sound reaching 140 decibels, the threshold that can cause permanent hearing damage. And keep in mind that people in the military are generally using much louder rounds than this and often firing from automatic weapons, especially in close quarters or in a place where sound can reverberate easily, such as a scene inside a car. The sound would be amplified a lot. Your ears would painfully ring, and you would have difficulty hearing anything at all for a bit, much less detailed orders being yelled by someone 20 feet away from you. This is why modern militaries not only try to wear proper ear protection, but also link their comms to it, allowing them to communicate effectively on the battlefield, even with the deafening booms of gunfire all around.
And that right there is a game changer on the battlefield if one side has it and one doesn't, right? Because he's absolutely right. We don't really think about how loud. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's wait till the end.
Despite this, hearing loss is still a huge issue in the world's armies and is one of the most common service-related injuries. A study performed on US soldiers returning from Iraq found that 87% reported some level of hearing disturbance, 75% reported tinnitus, a constant ringing in their ears, and that 50% had substantial hearing loss compared to peers their age. The issue is even worse for people who commonly fire heavy weapons such as rocket launchers, which can be much, much louder. And now think back to the World Wars, or even the Korean War, when such great ear protection was not nearly as commonplace as it is today, and you can probably see just how damaging the whole ordeal would have been to soldiers' ears. All of this is why it's often said that the most unrealistic thing about the John Wick series is not the fact that he always survives impossible scenarios and escapes explosions unscathed, but the fact that he is not completely deaf by the end of the first movie.
So, if you've ever been to a reenactment where there's a lot of weapons being fired, especially like I just came back a couple of weeks ago, I went to D-Day, Ohio, up in Conneaut, Ohio, and you've got a couple of hundred guys firing guns, and you're hundreds of yards away from it, and it was deafening. I can only imagine if you are involved in a firefight, like something like D-Day, where you're thousands of people landing on the beaches and engaged over a span of 50 miles or so, and you've got naval guns going off, and you've got bombers, and you've got big artillery pieces and machine guns being fired. The chaos, we don't think about the chaos and the confusion that happens on a battlefield. Plus, in like a Civil War battle or earlier than that, the smoke, because you don't have smokeless powder yet. It would be difficult to see. It's going to be difficult to hear. It's really confusing. And that's something that doesn't often get portrayed very well in movies and TV shows.
Movies love tanks. They're big, they're intimidating, they're heavily armed. Their arrival on the scene to back up the good guys elicits cheers from the main characters, and their showing up means that a tough battle's about to take place. But as much as movies love these armored beasts, they get quite a few things wrong about them. The most glaring of these issues is obvious to anyone familiar with tanks, and that is the fact that producers will often try to replace historical tanks with more readily available models. Slap some World War II era German symbols on whichever tank you can get your hands on, and BAM! The Wehrmacht is rolling in. This is normally due to the fact that historical models are not always available, especially in large quantities for a big scene, but vehicle accuracy aside, Hollywood still tends to screw up several important things, leading to some pretty pervasive myths. The first mistake is making tanks appear far too weak, giving audiences the impression that they aren't really much of a force to be reckoned with. A great example of this is the scene from the movie White House Down, when a single rocket from an RPG destroys an approaching M1 Abrams. In reality, shooting the front armor on an Abrams is probably the worst place to aim, since it's the most protected area, and secondly, there is no way that it would have even disabled the tank, let alone have blown the entire thing sky high. On the flip side, there are...
And I'll say this about that. Generally, you're not going to see a tank just explode like that anyway, unless you hit the ammunition inside of it.
Movies which give audiences the impression that tanks are essentially invincible, sustaining multiple shots from rocket launchers or even from other tanks and continuing to trudge forward. In reality, how easy a tank is to destroy depends on many factors, such as which munitions are being fired at it and where on the tank they are striking. There's also the common misconception that when a critical shot is finally landed, the tank explodes in a giant fireball. This is usually when the main character lowers whatever weapon they just used to save the day and leaves the scene as the tank carcass burns in the background. But while this certainly is a possibility, especially if the ammunition store is struck, these grandiose explosions are not always the end goal of a battle with a tank. In the Second World War, many tanks were disabled by enemy fire, either by destroying one of their tracks or causing serious damage to their engine, and they were subsequently knocked out of the fight but never exploded in a massive detonation. During the Battle of Kursk in World War II, one of the largest tank operations in history, it was difficult to estimate German tank losses from certain engagements, as they made a considerable effort to tow disabled tanks off the battlefield and repair them quickly enough to be back in action after a short while. All in all, there's no doubt that it's difficult to make a good tank scene in a movie, but there are quite a few things that producers could learn to make them a bit more accurate.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say about tanks too is the tank versus tank battle. It's actually much rarer than we think. tanks were often used as infantry support. And so these massive battles with thousands of tanks fighting against thousands of tanks, it rarely happened. I mean, Kursk is an example. Also, it's kind of cool to note that those turrets that are on top of those tanks, they're just sitting there. They're sitting there with their own weight. So if you tipped it on its side, the turret could actually just fall off. I think the same is true with battleships, things like that. But yeah, for all of its many glaring mistakes, the movie Fury does one thing really well, which is that it portrays that a lot of times the way you took out a tank was with an armor-piercing round that would actually heat up to the point where it would kind of soften the target and go through, and it would just leave a hole, and then that was how the tank got disabled. There wasn't a massive explosion and fire and people climbing out, burning and things like that. It did happen, like he said, especially if you were hitting the ammunition inside the tank, you would cause an explosion. But more often than not, it was disabling the tank so it couldn't move, like he said, with the tracks, or a shot that goes through and kind of bounces around and kills or seriously wounds everybody inside, but doesn't cause a massive explosion to the tank itself. Especially with airplanes.
By far the most prevalent inaccuracy across all war movies is the amount of ammunition expended by both sides in a firefight. You'll often see a character taking aim and firing their automatic weapon for the entire duration of the scene, running out of bullets after around 30 seconds, only to switch to their sidearm and continue shooting for the remainder of the fight. This gives the impression that in combat situations, the most effective thing to do is fire everything at your disposal in the general direction of the enemy and hope that you hit them. But
and it's that kind of portrayal that leads people to wonder why, for example, the military in those situations, like in World War II, for example, would issue to the standard rifleman a gun that had to be pulled. You had to pull the trigger for every round, right? Or even that it was a bolt action sometimes. Well, the fact is that if everybody had an automatic weapon where they could just pull down the trigger, hold down the trigger and shoot all their ammunition, they'd run out of ammo so fast they wouldn't be able to fight.
Completely ignores the fact that soldiers simply don't have as much ammunition as many movies like to show. The standard soldier in most Western armies is issued 210 rounds for their rifle, carried in 7 magazines. This can vary depending on the weapon and the specific mission about to be embarked on, but this really isn't as much firepower as you'd think, especially when you consider how fast these magazines can be used up. For instance, the M4A1, the standard issue rifle for both the US Army and the US Marine Corps, fires at a rate of up to 900 rounds per minute, meaning that if you hold down the trigger without a care in the world, your magazine will be empty in just a few seconds. And because soldiers don't want to have to reload 5 seconds into a firefight, they will generally fire in short bursts, also allowing for better accuracy if the engagement is at some distance. This also goes for pistols and can be much worse on screen. One of the most commonly used pistols in movies and TV shows is the classic Colt M1911, which you'll see being fired non-stop at whichever bad guys are deserters him led at that point. But the standard M1911 magazine only holds 7 rounds, giving you a total of 8 if you have one already loaded in the chamber. It's still a useful sidearm and one of the most reliable in history, but it's far from giving you 20 plus seconds of non-stop semi-automatic fire. The most egregious of these inaccuracies, though, is with revolvers. Next time you see a revolver on the silver screen, keep track of how many rounds it fires before reloading, because a surprising amount of times it will be shot a lot more than just 6.
He's out, right?
The same even goes for aircraft. After all, the famous...
I would say especially for aircraft, and that's probably where it's most egregious. We'll talk about that more in a second.
A-10 Warthog holds just under 1,200 rounds with a blistering fire rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, so pilots tend to fire in short controlled bursts. The same goes for most other aircraft out there, with many even holding much less ammunition and having even higher rates of fire, which is definitely not the impression you'd get watching a 15-minute dogfight where both planes continuously spray bullets at each other as they twist around in the sky. And all this ignores other myths movies perpetrate about firearms, such as the fact that bullets can easily travel through water. You'll often see scenes of someone...
All right, so I want to pause there and talk about the aircraft for a second, because my understanding is, like a Japanese Zero, for example, their wing cannons, if you just held down the trigger and fired, you're out in like less than 10 seconds. I mean, it's that little. A dogfight, you're... do that a couple times, you're done. I mean, even some of the other aircraft like I think like a P-51 for the Americans, maybe 20 seconds of ammo total if you just kind of fire it continuously. They did not carry that much ammunition to be able to just be fighting like those 15, 20-minute dogfights like he said. Absolutely true. Another one for me is the anti-aircraft fire. Like when you see World War II being portrayed with planes coming down, like dive bombers coming in or torpedo bombers coming in at naval aircraft or at naval ships. Like there's just anti-aircraft everywhere, and like in the movie Midway, it just seems impossible they'd get through it. It wasn't quite that much. I mean, you had a lot of planes coming at a target, and you had only so many guns that were firing and a certain rate of fire. Sometimes they show it being a little more than it probably was. But yeah, the ammunition thing is a big one.
One swimming with bullets cruising around them, tearing through the water.
Couple feet and they're done.
But this isn't how it would really go. Proven by none other than Mythbusters, who tested this exact scenario and found that just 3 feet of water is sufficient to disintegrate most supersonic rounds, and that after just a foot or two, the rounds will no longer be lethal.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of times law enforcement, when they're checking the ballistics on a weapon, they have a water tank that they'll fire into, because that's how quickly the bullet will slow down and stop completely.
These may be guilty of perpetrating many of the myths that we've covered today. Let's be honest, the creative liberties taken to make the films entertaining are, at the end of the day, probably worth it.
Yeah, he's right. They are totally probably worth it. Couple more for me, and this is one I've mentioned a lot in Civil War movies, and I understand why they do it this way. Artillery, the explosions are always coming up off the ground, right? Artillery hits the ground, it shoots guys into the air. I understand that because of the special effects involved, that's how artillery is going to be portrayed in movies, but that is not how artillery worked in the Civil War. They didn't have contact fuses that when it hit the ground, it exploded. The ones that actually exploded, they had fuses that were timed on them, and you had to set the fuse for a certain amount of time, and the goal was that it exploded in the air over your target and sprayed shrapnel down on them. Or they had solid shot very often. There's not really a great way to show that. Occasionally you see it, a movie like The Patriot, they show solid shot being fired, and it would hit the ground and then bounce up and take a guy's head off, or hit the ground and take a guy's leg off and go through multiple layers. That is how the solid shot would absolutely work. So it's difficult to portray artillery like Civil War and Revolutionary War artillery properly, just because of the logistics that would be involved in trying to portray that. But that's the reality with it. Another one for me is amputations without anesthetic during the Civil War, for example. They had anesthetic. They would often use chloroform or ether. The problem was in some of the bigger battles like a Gettysburg or a Chickamauga or Antietam, they ran out of that pretty quickly. But they did, absolutely. And especially if you were an officer, you were very likely to be knocked out cold before you had an amputation performed on you. Stonewall Jackson wasn't awake for his amputation, for example. That's just the reality of it. So I know they're trying to portray the horrors in those situations, but let's face it. Let me know what your pet peeves are when it comes to how things are portrayed inaccurately when it comes to military or war myths in movies and TV shows. Use the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Shout out to Anthony in Grand Island, New York, and Jesse right here in Northeast Ohio down the road from me in East Canton. Thank you guys for your support on Patreon. See you again soon. Thanks for watching.